Alastair, if you could talk about now what you make of Russia's approach overall, not just in the latest talks, but also just what we've seen in response to what has been, as you have said, almost like a fruitless endeavor around normalization and, of course, around getting to some real negotiations about settling the conflict. The Western mainstream media has been very much in panic about Russia's gains on the battlefield. Russia, Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and the rest have been very clear on their terms. So talk about if you see Russia at all budging on its terms and how recent developments have been informing or lacking in informing on what Russia's approach is here.
Well, first of all, I think has been his team has really led a very misconceived approach to this whole exercise. The faction that is led by Kellogg has been absolutely adamant on a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, and then afterwards we can talk. Apparently, Kellogg reportedly bases this on the sort of career experience where, suddenly the contact line became the line and it was settled. And then they said, well, we'll negotiate an agreement between the two Koreas later. Well, here we are, how many years later? And there's no agreement and there was no political solution. Putin understands that. And he understands that the aim of this is to provide the United States with a sense of victory. That if the conflict is so-called frozen, they keep saying it's a frozen conflict. It's not been a frozen conflict. It isn't a frozen conflict. The front line is moving every day. But they've insisted it's a frozen conflict. And the purpose of that freezing of the conflict is to preserve enough of Ukraine, rump Ukraine, that they can then rearm, come back, and attack and be a platform for further attacks on Russia. And, no one in Russia accepts that. They all understand that exactly, that's what the Western intent is to sort of, if you like, preserve enough and to have a ceasefire and to put NATO in to sort of monitor it. So while they, bring in NATO training, NATO weapons, and then prepare, Putin was fooled by that once. He's not going to be fooled by that again. And I was in Russia not so long ago, and the mood is quite changed. The Russians as a whole, and I was partly in St. Petersburg, which is a very liberal capital, but everyone understands now exactly that, the West is just using this Ukraine pretext to position itself to try and further undermine and weaken Russia. And so there's a huge support. I mean, people say, oh, well, it's not supported and everything. That's nonsense. You only have to look at the voluntary conscripts applying to join the Russian army. I mean, if it was suffering badly, if it was failing, people wouldn't be volunteering 35,000 a month like that to join the Russian army. You would be going off and finding something else to do. But that's what's happening. And so there is support for Putin. They understand that Putin is, if you like, playing chess with the whole of NATO and with the Western world. And that he has to prevail because it's an existential need of Russia to prevail in this conflict.
You wrote in your latest piece about how Russia is seeking to comprehend the various constraints on Trump. You wrote that Ukraine was on a path of a slow fuse self-destruction, I think you put it as. Talk about the condition of Ukraine in this respect and of NATO and the U.S. side, because I'm wondering if talks are more about them, more about their situation than about Russia's particular needs and desires.
Well, of course, Europe and the United States are desperate that there shouldn't be a great defeat, that it shouldn't be like Kabul, and the sort of fall of Kabul and the terrible scenes of the, fleeing out of Kabul, that shouldn't be repeated from Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. But certainly the Ukraine is under their military forces are effectively in the first stages of collapsing. Particularly Pokrovsk is the hub, the center of it, but it extends up the whole line. And you recall Hemingway's old adage about bankruptcy. He was asked what bankruptcy was like, and he said it starts off slowly, 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 and then very fast. And there are signs that things are already becoming very fast. There's a great deal of disillusion amongst the military commanders. They don't like to be told, you've got to defend this village to the last man, when the Russians simply are overpowering in numbers and in military support. So it is on the point of collapsing. Does Trump understand this? Maybe he's occasionally made comments about the fact that maybe it will be the military situation that will define the outcome. And he's right on that. That's right. It is going to be decided on the battlefield, not in a negotiation between in Istanbul. It'll be decided on the battlefield. The details, maybe, yes, will have to be sorted out in Istanbul. But yes, it will be decided on the battlefield. And it's looking as if it's getting closer and closer to a final resolution, a denouement of this conflict. And that's why he's so desperate to get something that can be presented to the American public as, America won again. We haven't been defeated. We really won, and Russia has been weakened by this whole process. I mean, of course, it's just nonsense, but increasingly the West relies on narratives rather than facts on the ground to persuade people. We can always construct or craft a narrative to suggest that it may look like defeat, but really it was a win. But it's becoming less and less credible, and everyone understands that. And Europe, in particular, is in a sort of state of despair over it, because so much of the EU, their ability to preserve the EU, hinges around the sort of rallying around the flag of Ukraine, pretending that Ukraine is somehow Europe, which it isn't, but pretending it's somehow Europe against the terrible Slavs. I mean, it's just an identity politics that was first started by Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the 70s when he wrote his great chessboard and said, whatever we do, if Ukraine is part of Russia, then Russia may end up controlling the heartland of Asia. If Russia without Ukraine is just a regional power. So the purpose of American policy is to make sure that Ukraine is outside of the sphere, the geographic, the military sphere of Russia. That is our aim, and that's what's being pursued. And the ceasefire talk is just a tool to that end.
It appears Ukraine is talking a lot about ceasefires, talking a lot about after the war of late. He's been having talks with Trump, with the EU, with Ursula von der Leyen regularly. And I just wanted to highlight this part. Ukraine seeks a real and fair end to this war. And of course, emphasizing the importance of Europe, as has been the case. But it's this language talking about after the war that is much more common. Talk about Zelensky's position and why Zelensky might be talking more and more about after the war now than at any point of its tenure.
Because there's been a sea change in Ukraine, and defeat is now apparent to all of the military, Ukrainian military. It's even apparent to European military leaders. They can see that, the defeat is inevitable. How long it'll come, and they're just trying to slow it down and try and find some way of postponing it or pushing it back sufficiently so there will be, something left that they can then build into another, if you like, NATO proxy in Ukrainian territory. But of course, this is why the special operation was cast from the beginning to say that Ukraine has to be neutral and that its ability to have arms and weapons will be limited, and it will have to eschew any attempt to join NATO. So these are the red lines of Russia, and I think Putin will continue, but it may not be so long till we get near to that sort of level. And Zelensky is casting around, threshing around, trying to find a solution out of this. But there isn't a solution out of this because, these are, events. These are the events on the ground. Ukraine is losing the war. Russia is slowly taking the key hubs and the military, if you like, strategic positions. And will soon be on the Dnieper and maybe even in Kiev. And then, what's he going to do? Go into government in exile or something? Well, all of that is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next. Russians probably have a better idea than certainly I do. But, we're going into a sort of new territory. And this is unsettling the West deeply. And therefore they threaten and they bluster and they say, oh, this has got to be done. But most of this is, as we say in English, water off a duck's back in the case of Putin.
What exactly is happening to Zelensky? Even Kiev Independent, Ukrainian media is talking about his popularity sinking. Of course, there were these protests that were about institutions that were set up almost to prop up the Ukraine war, like NABU, and yet it's those who are supportive of that who are protesting him because of moves he made around these so-called anti-corruption agencies. So what is happening? It feels like things are imploding, but what is your understanding of that?
Well, it's very hard to make any sort of transition in Ukraine because right from the outset of this crisis, Maidan, and even before, even going back, if you like, to the end of the Second World War, the Western intelligence services, CIA, MI6 particularly, were putting in, if you like, very nationalistic, radical nationalists into the key positions in the military, the intelligence, and the police, precisely to stop them, if you like, at any stage coming to some sort of agreement with Russia. And they're still there, and they still have considerable power, and they still have power over Zelensky. So it's very hard for the next stage, if you like, the baby isn't being easily born of the next stage to Ukraine. And Zelensky's trying to keep it all, the support for him, the money flowing, the weapons flowing, so he can pretend, that there's a chance maybe in the future sometime we can get back Crimea and all of these other territories if only you will come to our aid. But I mean, essentially, a defeat is a defeat. And, it has large consequences, psychic consequences on your people. And so, he's trying to manage that not very successfully. And I think the West is casting around for who they'd like to have in his place. But there isn't really a very obvious example. And of course, behind him stand really, the nationalist zealots who may not be willing to let him go. I mean, telling him, you go forward, you're on the front line, and behind him stand the bayonets.
As a former diplomat with a lot of understanding and experience in this field, a lot of audience members ask me and ask guests of mine, well, why then does Russia, as you said earlier, that Russia is going to settle this on the battlefield, why does Russia emphasize so much diplomacy, even diplomacy with the United States, whenever it becomes available. How does this benefit or serve to not benefit Russia? What's your understanding?
I think the first thing I would say is that, as a person who's done these negotiations, it's always essential to keep a channel of communications open, to have some ability to communicate with your adversaries or with the other side, if you like. So I think it's very important to do that, because sometimes, events can lead up almost to the brink of war because of a misunderstanding, a stupid sentence, misunderstood or something. I've been in that situation where something nearly exploded and everything went to pieces, and it was just a misunderstanding that existed. So channels of information, channels of communication are important. But I think, what you have to understand, and what your viewers, I'm sure, understand, Putin is not fighting the Kiev. He's fighting the collective NATO. All of it, many parts of it are in Ukraine. Of course, the support, the intelligence support, the weapons have been crucial. NATO is fully engaged in this process. And he is also trying to manage the question of the global South, an opinion in the global South, opinion in India, in China. China is well on side with Russia, but he has to think about, the overall big picture. And I think in that context, he's very conscious of the sensitivity of the American psyche. When there's a big rehearsal, oh, that's 9/11, Pearl Harbor. Oh, what are we going to do? We have to do something. So he tries to do it slowly, slowly, slowly. But nonetheless, you shouldn't see that purely in a Western way. Westerners like to think of military thrusts, a tank column driving through the lines. They think of what happened in Iraq, even though that's misunderstood, but they think of, the Desert Storm and, going through and smashing by a big thrust. Whereas Russia puts pressure right across the line. All the points, not all together, all at once, but pretty well all together, maybe back a bit, then back forward. But the pressure accumulates and accumulates until instead of a thrust going in the middle, the thing just decomposes, just disintegrates under the sort of widespread pressure. So the strategy is quite different from how NATO or the West understand it, and that leads to misunderstandings. But Putin has always, and Russia's been very clear, this is an existential threat to us. And the answer to it is we have to have and discuss. And they're willing to discuss it. They even put out papers, I think in December 23, saying we need to have a proper security architecture in Europe. And I think that this must be perfectly obvious to everyone who's watching this video. We do need that, because none of us want to end up in something that escalates into a nuclear war.
Do you find that some of my channel have been on here and said that, the only way to enforce that kind of security architecture, the only way to address the root causes, as Russia has put it, to fully achieve demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, is to essentially move into a mode of not only breaking down the front lines, but taking Odessa and then moving even forward, even to the point of where political control in Kiev is dictated by Russia. Do you see it this way, or is there another path out of this?
Oh, of course. Russia, I don't know. Of course, I'm not privy to their plans. But, Odessa is the key to the Black Sea. And the West and NATO have been trying to get hold of the Black Sea for a long time, for 200 years or so. It's been and would be, of course, if the West held Odessa, there would be a direct threat to Crimea. So I would think it would be unlikely that they would leave that. How far they go, I think I've been in situations, I mean, I'm not a military person, but I've been in Afghanistan. It's amazing how quickly it's like an avalanche. You start off with a little change and then suddenly things slip and slip and slip. And you shouldn't, once it breaks down, it can break down very quickly. It may take longer or it may be shorter, but the pressures that Russia is putting on it is precisely that, to get to the point at which there is systemic collapse, not just of the military, but systemic collapse of the whole structure of the extreme nationalists in Kiev and the whole system. And when that is done, then, I think Russia will sort of pull back a bit, and we will see who comes forward and wants to take on the job of sort of restoring, Ukrainian restoring, normal life, which is what everyone is wanting in Ukraine, to return to Ukraine under something like an effective government.
Yeah, and the question is can the combined West, the collective West, accept such a scenario?
No. No, but they may have to. I mean, that's the end of it, is that they may have to. And, you have to put up with it. They have to put up with what happened in Kabul. That's life. This is what facts in the battlefield mean. If you're defeated, and it's painful. You have to pick yourself up, pull yourself together, and accept it. It is going to be very hard, harder for the Europeans than for America, because they've suffered a whole series of humiliating defeats in the financial field. And the European Union, really only has this glue. It's a very strange glue, because it's an artificial identity that has been put together to give this glue, but they only have this glue. And once that falls, you'll have the Baltic states going in one direction, you have Italy and Spain and the Mediterranean states saying, no, we want to go and have good relations with Russia. We'll have many Germans saying, let's restart the Nord Stream. And the EU will not survive that, I think.
Yeah, I just remember the last time I was in Europe a couple of years ago, and seeing just how invested Europe at all levels, whether it's in the streets of Berlin or in Brussels, you see just how inundated Europe is and invested in this conflict. And as you said, it's so directly connected to their economic life now that pulling out is going to be very challenging. Yeah,
sure. What you say is true of the elites of the establishment.
Yes, exactly.
It's not true of the people.
Yep.
There is not a clamor for war with Russia in Europe. This is a fiction. I mean, I live here in Italy, and I can tell you, no one's, sort of gagging to go to war with Russia at all. And everyone's feeling the economic pain. And, they despise those elites in Brussels. They really dislike them, and they know the elites despise them back. This is the rift. So it's not all of Europe
totally.
In that sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the sense is. And because, like a traveler like me, you're going to be in those tourist areas, in where that kind of capital is. And that's where the messaging, the shaping of the narrative, you just see it all around. That's how they're trying to, and they failed to convince people that this is a worthwhile project. And heck, it's almost been 3 years now, and I think the results speak for themselves.